The Orphan's Diary. Chapter 1. The Antique Store. Abigail King loved collecting old books and diaries. She believed each one held a piece of someone's soul, frozen in time. There was something about the faded ink, the crinkled pages, and the musty scent of aging paper that transported her to another era. She often imagined the hands that had once held these books, the thoughts that had been recorded within them, and the emotions poured into each word. One rainy afternoon, the sky was a deep shade of gray, and the rhythmic patter of raindrops against her umbrella filled the air as she wandered into an antique store on the outskirts of town. The store, an old brick building with a weathered wooden sign reading, Evermore Antiques, stood at the end of a quiet street. A small brass bell jingled as she pushed open the heavy oak door, and the scent of aged paper, polished wood, and something faintly floral greeted her. Dusty shelves lined the walls, filled with forgotten relics of the past, vintage clocks, porcelain dolls, and stacks of brittle newspapers. Faded portraits of unknown ancestors hung in ornate frames, their gazes following her as she moved through the dimly lit aisles. Abigail had always found a strange comfort in places like this, where time seemed to stand still. Her fingers trailed over the spines of aged tomes, pausing on a collection of Victorian-era novels. Just as she was about to reach for a particularly ornate volume, something on the far shelf caught her eye. A small, worn leather-bound diary tucked between two hefty encyclopedias. It was unassuming, its cover scratched and faded, but something about it called to her. Curious, she pulled it free and turned it over in her hands. The edges of the pages were yellowed with time, and the leather cover bore the faint imprint of an intricate design, long since worn away. She carefully opened the first page, revealing delicate handwriting in ink that had faded to a soft brown. The diary was dated 1902, and the name, Eleanor Whitmore, was written in elegant script at the top of the first page. "That one's been here for ages," a voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see the shopkeeper, an elderly man with silver-rimmed glasses and a wool cardigan, watching her with mild interest. "No one's ever wanted it." Abigail glanced down at the diary again, an inexplicable sense of connection stirring within her. "Why not?" The shopkeeper hesitated, then shrugged. "Not sure. Some folks who've picked it up said it gave them an odd feeling." "Gave it right back. But you're welcome to it if you like." A chill ran down Abigail's spine, but she shook it off. She wasn't one to be superstitious. If anything, the idea that others had shied away from it only made her more intrigued. She ran her fingers over the fragile pages again, the ink barely legible in some places. What stories did this girl have to tell? What secrets lay hidden within these pages? "I'll take it," she said without hesitation. The shopkeeper nodded and rang up the purchase. As Abigail handed over the cash, he wrapped the diary carefully in brown paper and slid it into a cloth bag. "Hope you find what you're looking for in there," he said, his tone strangely solemn. She offered a polite smile before stepping back out into the rain. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet pavement and autumn leaves. Clutching the bag to her chest, she hurried toward home, her heart pounding with anticipation. She had read many diaries before, but something told her this one was different. When she finally arrived at her small apartment, she wasted no time. She kicked off her damp boots, lit a few candles to chase away the gloom of the rainy afternoon, and settled into her favorite armchair with a cup of tea. The diary sat before her on the coffee table, waiting. Taking a deep breath, she unwrapped the brown paper and opened the cover once more. The first few pages contained brief notes, lists of daily chores, mentions of family members, but as she turned to a later entry, her pulse quickened. "June 12th, 1902, I saw him again today. The man in the gray coat. He was standing by the old willow tree, watching the house. I told Mother, but she said I was imagining things. I know what I saw, and I know that he saw me too. A shiver ran down Abigail's spine. Who was Eleanor talking about? A neighbor? A stranger? And why was she so unnerved by him? She turned the page. June 15th, 1902. He was closer today. I heard footsteps outside my window last night. When I looked, he was gone, but I know he was there. Mother still won't believe me. I wish father were home. He would listen. Abigail's fingers tightened around the edge of the diary. This wasn't just an ordinary account of a young girl's life. This was a mystery. And she was determined to uncover the truth hidden within Eleanor Whitmore's words. Outside, the rain continued to fall, but inside, Abigail was already lost in the past, following Eleanor's story one faded word at a time. Chapter 2. Eleanor's Story. That evening, with a cup of tea in hand, Abigail opened the diary and began reading. The pages were yellowed, the ink slightly faded, but Eleanor's words were still legible, as if frozen in time, whispering their secrets from the past. September 3rd, 1902. It has been another night of sleeplessness. The beds are hard, the blankets thin, and the draft from the broken window seeps into my bones. The other children are just as restless, their bodies curled into tight knots in a vain attempt to find warmth. Sister Beatrice does not care. She merely watches from the doorway, her arms folded across her chest like a vulture waiting for something to die. Abigail shuddered and turned the page, her fingers trembling slightly. Eleanor's words painted a bleak picture of life in St. Mary's orphanage. She described days spent scrubbing floors until her knuckles bled, of tasteless gruel served with a wooden ladle, and of punishments so cruel they left invisible scars on the soul. October 14th, 1902. Jonathan is gone. Sister Agnes says he was adopted, but he never spoke of leaving. We whispered about our dreams of finding a family, of being wanted, of escaping these walls, but Jonathan would have told me, wouldn't he? The others are uneasy. I hear them talking in hushed tones, afraid to speak too loudly lest they too disappear. Abigail's grip tightened on the diary. The handwriting began to change, becoming uneven, frantic, the ink darker as if pressed harder into the paper. Eleanor's words carried an urgency, a fear that leapt off the pages and wrapped around Abigail's chest. November 6th, 1902. It's real. The shadow. I have seen it. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of soft footsteps in the hallway. I held my breath and pulled the thin blanket up to my chin. The candle in the corridor flickered, and I saw it, a shape that did not belong. It moved against the dim light, slipping through the darkness, like ink spilling across parchment. I tried to convince myself it was just Sister Beatrice making her rounds, but I knew better, because when I blinked it was inside the room. The next morning, Miriam was gone. The sister said she, too, had been adopted. But I remember the way her bed was still warm when I reached over, the way her doll lay abandoned on the floor. Miriam would never have left it behind. Abigail swallowed hard. The tea had gone cold in her hands, but she hardly noticed. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears as she flipped through more pages. Eleanor wrote about whispers among the orphans, about a presence that lurked in the hallways when the lights went out. Some of the younger children had nightmares of long, clawed fingers reaching for them in the dark. Others refused to sleep at all, their hollow-eyed gazes darting toward the door as if expecting it to open at any moment. December 2nd, 1902. I cannot ignore it anymore. The others are too afraid to speak, but I will write it here, so I do not forget. There is something here with us. Something that watches, that waits. I stayed awake last night listening. The floorboards creaked, but not from the weight of a person. The sound was slower, more deliberate, as if something was gliding across the wood rather than stepping on it. I held my breath, praying it would pass. Then the whisper came. My name. It spoke my name. I wanted to scream, to wake the others, but I was frozen. When I finally gathered the courage to sit up, the door to the dormitory was ajar. The candle in the hallway was out, and at the foot of my bed, I swear I saw two pinpricks of light, eyes, watching me. Abigail shut the book, her breathing shallow. The room around her seemed darker than before, the corners filled with shadows that hadn't been there a moment ago. She forced herself to take a deep breath. It was just a diary, just the ramblings of a frightened child from over a century ago, wasn't it? Her gaze fell back on the worn leather cover. She hesitated, then flipped open to the last entry Eleanor had written. December 24th, 1902. It knows I am afraid. I hear it whispering my name, even when I am awake now. Sister Beatrice looks at me with knowing eyes, but she says nothing. She is afraid too. I see it in the way her hands tremble when she holds her rosary. Tonight is Christmas Eve. The sisters say we must pray, that we must repent, that only faith will protect us. But faith did not save Jonathan. It did not save Miriam. And I fear it will not save me either. If anyone finds this diary, please, remember us. Remember what happened here. And do not let the shadows take you too. The entry ended abruptly. There were no more pages, no explanations, just silence. Abigail stared at the diary, a deep unease settling in her chest. Something had happened to Eleanor. Something had happened to all of them. And now, over 100 years later, she had stumbled upon their story. But was the story truly over? A floorboard creaked behind her. Chapter 3. The Tragic End. The diary entries became more erratic. Eleanor wrote about a friend named Lillian who vanished without a trace. Then another child disappeared. Fear seeped into her words. The last entry was dated March 5th, 1903. I hear footsteps outside my door. I think it's coming for me next. If anyone finds this, please don't forget us. Don't let them erase us. The page was stained, as if someone had wept over it. Abigail closed the diary, her heart pounding. The air around her seemed heavier, charged with an eerie presence. She ran her fingers over the inked words, tracing their desperation. What had happened to Eleanor? To Lillian? And to all the other children of St. Mary's Orphanage? Determined, Abigail grabbed her laptop and typed, St. Mary's Orphanage Fire 1903. The search results were sparse. Most sources confirmed that the orphanage had burned down, but there was little mention of casualties or survivors. It was as if the children had been erased from history. One article caught her attention, an old newspaper clipping archived in the city records. She clicked on the link, her breath hitching as the image of a crumbling, charred building filled the screen. The article, dated March 7th, 1903, read, Tragedy at St. Mary's Orphanage. A fire consumed St. Mary's Orphanage late on the evening of March 5th, 1903. The cause remains unknown. There are no known survivors. The matron, Sister Beatrice, was found deceased near the front entrance, seemingly attempting to unlock the main doors. The children's records were lost in the blaze. Authorities are investigating, but have found no conclusive evidence of foul play. No survivors. No records. No names. It was as if they had never existed. Abigail's fingers trembled as she scrolled further. A side column contained a short interview with a local resident from 1903. I heard the screams, said Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, a neighbor who lived nearby. But by the time anyone got there, the place was engulfed in flames. The strangest thing, when I looked out my window just before the fire started, I swear I saw children standing in the snow, watching the building burn. Abigail gasped. Eleanor Whitmore. Could it be? The same Eleanor who had written the diary. If she had survived, why wasn't she listed among the rescued? She needed more answers. Abigail drove to the city archives, where she hoped to find something, Anything that would tell her more. The room smelled of aged paper and dust, and the dim light cast eerie shadows across the towering shelves of forgotten history. She flipped through fragile, yellowed documents until she found a ledger from 1903. Her pulse quickened when she saw an entry for St. Mary's Orphanage. March 6, 1903. All records lost. No remains of children recovered. Then, a note scrawled in a different hand. But I saw them. The children. They were there. The ink was smudged, as if someone had tried to erase the words but failed. Abigail's head swam. Who had written this? A witness? A survivor? Why was there no mention of Eleanor in any of these records? And what had she meant in her final entry? Don't let them erase us. A sudden chill filled the air. The overhead light flickered. Abigail glanced around, suddenly aware of how alone she was in the archives. Or was she? A whisper brushed against her ear, so faint, she almost thought she imagined it. Help us. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. No one was there. Just the silent rows of records and the weight of forgotten stories pressing down on her. She had to dig deeper. Abigail decided to visit the site where the orphanage once stood. She found herself on a desolate patch of land on the outskirts of town, where the ruins of the old foundation still remained. A bitter wind howled through the trees, and the ground beneath her feet felt unnaturally cold. As she stepped closer to the remnants of the building, she noticed something half buried in the dirt. A rusted locket. Heart hammering, she picked it up and wiped away the grime. Inside was a faded photograph of two girls, their names barely legible beneath it. Eleanor and Lillian. Abigail's breath hitched. It was them. Proof that they had existed. But why had the world forgotten them? As the sun dipped below the horizon, the air thickened with a palpable energy. And then she saw them. Figures. Faint, flickering outlines of children standing in clearing, their faces obscured by shadow. They did not move. They only watched. Abigail's voice trembled. Eleanor. The tallest figure stepped forward, and though her features were blurred, Abigail knew it was her. We never left, Eleanor whispered. They tried to erase us. But you remember now. A deep, guttural sound rumbled through the earth beneath them. The figures flinched. The shadows stretched, coiling around their small forms like tendrils of darkness. Eleanor's voice was urgent now. Find the truth before it takes us again. The wind roared, and the figures began to fade. Abigail reached out, but they were gone. The only sound left was the whisper of the wind and the rustling of leaves. Clutching the locket to her chest, Abigail knew one thing for certain. She was not finished. Not yet. Because someone had tried to erase Eleanor and the others from history. And if she didn't uncover the truth, they would be lost forever. And so would she. Chapter 4. The Haunting Truth. Unable to shake the feeling that Eleanor's story wasn't over, Abigail found herself drawn back to the orphanage's ruins the following day. The morning sun cast long shadows over the remnants of charred walls, their skeletal remains standing in eerie defiance against time. The wind whispered through the collapsed beams, carrying echoes of the past. Abigail pulled her coat tighter around her as she carefully stepped over broken bricks and blackened wood, each footfall sending a dull thud through the quiet air. As she ventured deeper into the wreckage, she felt something, an unshakable sensation of being watched. The silence wasn't empty. It was thick, charged with an energy that prickled against her skin. Then, a voice, no louder than a breath, brushed against her ear. Don't forget us. Abigail spun around, her pulse hammering. Her breath came in sharp gasps as she scanned the ruins, but she was alone. Or so it seemed. She reached into her bag, where the diary nestled against her other belongings. It felt heavier than before, as though it carried more than just words within its pages. The weight wasn't just physical. It was something else, something intangible but undeniable. A sudden gust of wind howled through the remains of the orphanage, kicking up a swirl of ash and dust. Abigail coughed, shielding her eyes as the debris settled. When she lowered her arm, she saw them, faint outlines in the shadows, flickering like candle flames. Children. Their expressions were solemn, their eyes filled with something between longing and despair. A chill ran down her spine, but fear did not take hold. Instead, an overwhelming sense of sorrow settled in her chest. "I see you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. The figures lingered for a moment longer before fading, dissolving into the ruins as though the very air had swallowed them whole. Abigail felt the weight in her bag shift again, and she knew Eleanor's story had chosen her for a reason. These children had waited long enough to be heard. Determined, she turned away from the ruins and made her way back to her car, her mind already composing the words she would write. This wasn't just a story, it was a truth buried beneath decades of silence and soot. Back at her apartment, Abigail spread out her notes and the diary across the small wooden desk. The dim light from her lamp cast flickering shadows on the pages, giving life to the words as she read them once more. Eleanor's voice, captured in ink, was clear in her mind. "We were forgotten, but we remember. We remember everything." Abigail's fingers trembled as she turned the pages, the scrawled handwriting growing more frantic toward the end. Eleanor had documented more than just her life. She had chronicled the pain, the fear, the injustice. It was more than a diary. It was a testament to the suffering endured within those walls. And now, it was Abigail's responsibility to share it. She began to type, her fingers flying over the keyboard. The words came easily, almost as if Eleanor herself was guiding them onto the screen. The fire, the neglect, the voices in the night. Abigail pieced it all together, ensuring every detail was recorded. Hours passed unnoticed as she wove the orphanage's tragic history into an article that demanded to be read. As the final sentence fell into place, she leaned back, exhaling sharply. She read over her work, feeling a mix of exhaustion and relief. The children would no longer be silent. That night, as she prepared for bed, she placed the diary on her bedside table, hesitating for a moment before turning off the light. The air in her apartment felt different, lighter, as if a weight had lifted. As she lay down, a soft sound drifted through the room, barely more than a whisper. A sigh of relief. For the first time since reading Eleanor's diary, Abigail closed her eyes and felt peace. The orphan's final wish had been honored, and somewhere, beyond the veil of the living, a group of forgotten souls could finally rest.